Welcome, everyone. It is my pleasure today to introduce you to Professor Kate Crawford, the newest member of our faculty. She joined us just last month as a research professor of communication here at Annenberg and as a faculty affiliate at the USC Center on Science, Technology, and Public Life. Kate is one of the world's foremost experts on the social implications of artificial intelligence, particularly the role of justice and power in socio-technical systems, asking critical questions such as what is the hidden cost of artificial intelligence and how is AI shaping our understanding of ourselves and our societies? Kate has had a truly fascinating career. She has spanned fields and disciplines, tech, media, art, design, and we're really excited about the ways that we know Kate will enrich our intellectual community with her pioneering interdisciplinary research. Kate is arriving with a small arsenal of contributions at the intersection of communication and AI, starting today with the launch of her book, The Atlas of AI, Power, Politics, and the Planetary Costs of Artificial Intelligence, in which she investigates AI as a technology of extraction from the energy and the minerals needed to build and sustain its infrastructure to the workers behind automated services to the data that's collected at vast scales. So we're thrilled to be able to toasting Kate in the launch of this book today. She's also going to be exploring that work further here with a 2-year project supported by the Sloan Foundation, an archaeological dig, as she describes it, looking at the foundations of AI, the training sets that power machine learning. She's also already spent time with our doctoral students, and she shared with me how excited she is to have regular opportunities to gather with you all to, of course, explore her research, but also to share her expertise in and out of the academic sphere. But now you're in for a very special conversation with Kate, led by our very own Professor Josh Kuhn, Chair in Cultural Communication, who, as you know, is an award-winning cultural historian. He's a critic, curator, and a 2016 MacArthur Fellow. His career also spans fields and disciplines, and so he's going to explore some of the key themes in Professor Crawford's book, which has been described as an urgent account of what is at stake as technology companies use artificial intelligence to reshape the world. And as always, we're going to open it up to your questions as well. So please join me in welcoming USC Annenberg professors Crawford and Kuhn. And Josh, special thanks for the music in the waiting room, as always.
Thank you, Willow. Hi, Kate.
Hey, Josh. Lovely to
Yes,
see you. Thank you
we
so much, Willow. That was a lovely introduction.
We're thrilled. In case you couldn't tell, we're really thrilled to have you here with us and to be celebrating your book launch. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I'll let you two take it away.
we should give a little shout out to that music. The new album by Mouse on Mars, titled AI, Anarchic Artificial Intelligence. We'll see if that's even possible. If there is a possibility for AI anarchism, we'll get to that later, Kate.
But nice thought, though. We can hope.
I just want to say it's really it's an honor to be able to be in conversation with you, especially on this big day for this book. So congratulations on the book, and thanks so much for spending the time with us.
Josh, the honor is entirely mine. I'm incredibly excited to be at Annenberg with you in this, virtual series of Brady Bunch boxes that we can be with each other today. And I'm particularly honored that we're having this conversation just after you had your second vaccine dose. So we're going to be clinging to the hope that you're feeling all right all the way to the end.
I'm not responsible for what comes out of my mouth over the next time. So I wanted to maybe start, as Willow noted, the kind of frame of your book, focusing on the planetary costs of AI. It's a devastating critique of AI. And so as I was preparing for today, I wanted to do, the kind of a quick little lazy bit of research, which is just to do a very quick kind of trending story search about AI. And as of yesterday, there was the top 4 stories. Only one of them contained a hint of the critique that you're talking about. And that was a story about the risk of AI emotion recognition. But the other stories were how AI software, I guess this is a good thing, wrote a new Nirvana song. I think they were framing that as a good thing. I'm not sure I would qualify that as a good thing. But more seriously, that AI, there are now AI systems that can detect melanoma and AI systems that can design antibiotics. So for the next hour, we're going to be focusing on the critiques that you so eloquently and brilliantly have researched and theorized in the book. But I wanted to maybe start with the flip side of it, just as a kind of opening moment, about for you in doing your, not just this book, but all your work on AI over the years. How do you balance this question of critiquing these systems and the quote unquote good that they can do?
I mean, it's interesting, even just thinking about that ratio of stories that you looked at, that there's certainly not much balance right now. We are subject to huge amounts of marketing hype and advertising and boosterism around artificial intelligence. In many cases, I think without full scientific validation and rigor in terms of those claims, we've seen even in the space of healthcare where there are exciting things happening with AI. We've seen all sorts of issues where systems have been deployed too early. They haven't been tested thoroughly enough, partly because of the push from industry to just really implant these tools across so many sectors simultaneously. We have them in healthcare, education, criminal justice, hiring. And it's happening at a pace that certainly, I think, independent verification, but also regulation is really falling behind. So I think for me, part of what I do is really look at the way in which artificial intelligence is not just, a series of algorithms or code that, in some ways can provide, startlingly useful forms of statistical analysis, which is really what it is. But to really look at this much bigger set of questions around what happens when we create these planetary scale computational networks. Who gains, but also who loses? Because there are some very real harms that can be produced by these systems. And to really understand that, we have to look at what does it take to build these systems? What happens to the energy costs, to the environmental costs, but also to the labor exploitation along the entire supply chain? And then finally, these sort of truly vast amounts of data that Willow referred to in her introduction. To try and look at that bigger picture, I think gives us a better chance to do this sense of evaluation. Because right now, I think we're kept at arm's length from understanding how these technical systems work and really in some ways just being told they're magic, they're wonderful, they should be used everywhere. And I'm very skeptical of those claims. And the more you look, the more you see we should be really pushing back on some of them.
I was, in reading this book, I confess I didn't know what I didn't know what to expect in terms of the kind of methods that you were going to use in the book, and the kind of point of views that you were going to take. And one of the things that really surprised me in a wonderful way was just how kind of immersed in historical methodologies the book is, and how interested in you are in history and prehistories, right, of these hyper contemporary systems. So I wanted to maybe start there, which is this question of kind of, for you, where and when can you say where and when AI begins? I mean, there seems to be a kind of laundry list of possible beginnings. Some one kind of common origin story, the Dartmouth math department in the 1950s, but also you suggest maybe the Ford assembly line. Some could say the birth of internet and cloud computing. I thought of the phonograph, the idea of a talking machine. But your book suggests at least two origins. And one is an 18th century mechanical chess player, and the other is a 19th century horse.
Yes.
So how do you, is it worth periodizing AI? Is that even a worthwhile move?
Well, I do believe in the maxim to always historicize, but particularly in the case of artificial intelligence, because it is so often seen as, in some ways, futuristic or the stuff of science fiction. Whereas in actual fact, it's very prosaic. It's built into so many back-end systems that we don't even think about every day. So absolutely, for this book, it was really important for me to immerse myself, not just in the historical archives of AI in its particular sort of mathematical and computer science history, which is fascinating and has changed so much in just the last 65 years in terms of its approaches and its goals, but also to go much further back. And I love the fact that you've brought up Clever Hans the horse, who is somebody that I find particularly fascinating. This horse was the star of Europe at the turn of the 20th century, because Clever Hans seemed to be able to perform feats of mathematical tasks and linguistic tasks, to add up numbers, to know what day of the week it was. And this horse would tap out responses to questions on a little board that its trainer, Wilhelm von Osten, would sort of hold up for it. And for me, what's so interesting about the way that this moment in history can tell us something about the way that intelligence is recognized, understood, and defined, is the way in which Clever Hans became initially a huge spectacle. Everybody was thrilled, like, tell us more about this horse. There were huge public shows and displays, but then there were inquiries and commissions that were formed to see if there was some new form of animal intelligence that was emerging. And in these very sort of rigorous sort of scientific tests, it was found that in fact this horse was picking up on essentially entirely subconscious signals from its trainer, just saying that you don't even know how many sort of signals that you're giving that indicate what the correct answer might be. And that was the case in the case of Clever Hans. But to me, that also points to this question of how are we priming our technical systems to produce the answers that we expect. This is now actually a technical phenomenon that's called the Clever Hans effect, which is known in machine learning as a way in which if you give particularly skewed data, you will receive the answers, of course, that data will presuppose. So this is something that we see recurring in forms of bias and discrimination that emerge from these systems. But more broadly, it's about epistemologies of intelligence. How do we recognize it? How do we skew it? And what are the ways in which it shifts our social relationships to each other and to society more broadly?
So let's kind of get in maybe a little bit into the kind of questions of bias, but also more even kind of more front and center question, kind of histories of racial classification, gender classification, racial violence, gender violence, and this also is a historical question because you kind of throughout the book keep coming back to or something that haunts the book historically is the eugenics movement, and kind of craniometry and cranial studies and these kinds of things, but also you talk about Werner von Braun, who was a Nazi rocket builder that built the V2 rockets with concentration camp labor. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about these two histories of kind of racial pseudoscience and biological racism and mass death on the way that you're thinking about AI in the contemporary moment. I found that really kind of really stirring to see those histories. The eugenics aspect I had thought about and knew about, but particularly connecting it to von Braun and camps, and it just seemed like those connections were really, really powerful.
I mean, thank you for really following those threads. To me, these are the histories that are intertwined in how artificial intelligence is really understood and how it works. And to take the sort of the first strand first, this sort of tendency, I call it sort of the impulse to phrenology, which keeps recurring in technical systems, has very deep roots. It does go back to early foundations of eugenics, but also this idea that we can see into someone's character or personality or emotions simply by looking at their face or their head shape. These ideas have had, extraordinary periods of time where people took them extremely seriously, as though they could be sort of scientific merit to assess not just somebody's sort of racial purity, but also to understand, if they would be a good worker or a moral and upstanding citizen. To see the way in which we've now had machine learning studies that attempt to detect if somebody is going to be a criminal, or to detect somebody's sexuality, or in many cases, even just to assign them into classificatory categories for gender, for race, and for morality, these are things that are happening right now. One of the sort of extraordinary studies that really sort of shifted my thinking on this was a project that I did with the artist Trevor Paglen, where we spent 2 years really studying the most dominant training set for how essentially computer vision systems are trained to see the world. It's called ImageNet, and ImageNet contains over 14 million images and 20,000 categories. But as you start to unpack those categories and dig into them, you see this sort of shifting sands of how the world is being defined. In some cases, you can define a cat or a dog, and you'll have thousands of pictures of cats and dogs so that technical systems can make those delineations. But then you have a category for people. And inside the people category, you have things like girl and cheerleader and basketball player and CEO. And then you slowly start to see these logics emerge where the CEO category is predominantly white men, and we have basketball players, it's predominantly black men. And then we start to see even more problematic terms come up, which are essentially judging people's worth. We have categories for bad person, for kleptomaniac, for alcoholic. And all of these categories have pictures of people that have just been scraped off the internet. You know, it's somebody's graduation photo, it's somebody's holiday snaps that have become this substrate for training AI systems to engage with the world. And that was really shocking to me, the more I sort of dug into those layers with Trevor, and to think about the way in which those classificatory logics, which I think do harken back to phrenology, but also harken back to the way in which tools are used to control and delineate populations. So von Braun was sort of, a surprise turn in the book, and really came about because of spending time looking at Jeff Bezos's inspirations. Von Braun is a key figure for him, and a key figure for why he shifted from his sort of focus purely on Amazon as a sort of a planetary scale network, but to think as an interplanetary network. Jeff Bezos has now created a space company, which is called Blue Origin, and it was one of the locations that I visited for this atlas to try and go and photograph this reusable rocket base in the middle of West Texas. And here it was that sense again of who are the heroes that we lionize, and what are the visions of the world that are undergirded by those particular shifts. And for me to see that the billions of dollars generated by AI companies and by tech billionaires is now being redirected into a commercialized space race. This idea that now we've made this money, we can abandon the planet as sort of a discarded and useless object. Those trajectories and those ideologies run deep. So that's definitely been a real focus of this book.
So you mentioned a number of things that I want to come back to in a little bit, but maybe I'll start just to pick up with, again, back on the kind of method in the book that I also loved in its writing, is the kind of journalistic storytelling that you do. And you aren't just spending time with archives, and you aren't just theorizing. You are in your car and you are driving around, and you are going to places, and you are you're on site. Could you tell us a little bit? I think it's also really important especially for the students who are watching, about that choice, about how to balance that kind of storytelling, on the ground storytelling, with the scholarship and archival research that runs throughout the book.
Great. And let me take that in two parts. First, why I think that's necessary, why we have to put ourselves in those locations and to meet the people who are actually creating these systems. But also, methodologically, why that's a shift that I really enjoyed. Certainly in terms of why I made that decision, if you look at the way artificial intelligence is represented, it's so commonly understood in this highly abstract mathematical way, as though it's sort of code and algorithms. You looked at the top trending stories on AI. If you do a little search right now in Google for AI, just on image search, what you get back is just reams and reams of pictures of blue numbers and tunnels of code and white robots. They're always white. Again, a deep problem there. And this sort of sense of men in suits in front of control panels. This is the kind of way that we see AI represented as immaterial, as sort of floating in the cloud. It was incredibly important to me to look at that in a much more grounded way. What are the material consequences of these systems? They're not in this sort of dualistic, sort of Cartesian dualistic vision of intelligence, which is completely separated from embodiment and the earth. And to do that, to see artificial intelligence as material, as a product of bodies and the earth, you really have to go there. And so methodologically for me, that was the real shift when I was like, okay, we have to move it away from that abstract space of algorithmic nowhere to the specific somewheres where people and institutions are making choices and extracting from the environments around them. So that meant traveling around the world. It meant, doing road trips out to lithium mines in Nevada to see where, the last functioning mine is extracting lithium for the earth to create almost, extraordinary demand for lithium-ion batteries. By the way, speaking of horror stories, Josh, I was just reading a new report that came out last month that suggested that because we're using so much lithium-ion in our AI consumer devices and also electric vehicles, that we might be running out as soon as 2100. So we're looking again at these sorts of end of life of the resources that we use to create these massive technical systems. But it also meant that, I had to go into workplaces, but I also wanted to go into the sort of different sorts of workplaces to see the labor of AI. Rather than going to sort of Silicon Valley firms, there's great work that's done there, but I wanted to see sort of the back end labor, the people who are almost the connective tissue between automated systems and the products that we see in our homes. And that meant going inside things like Amazon fulfillment centers and spending time with people who are working, sort of picking things out of the shelves and getting them into the boxes that people have delivered to their houses every day. And these are really horrifying spaces. These are spaces of extreme sort of physical stress and repetition. I would see people, with bandages and with sort of support braces. And they're also a form of almost sort of algorithmic time pressure where people are working under what's called the rate, where you have to pick a certain number of objects every hour to sort of maintain Amazon's desire of having you as being the most efficient worker. And if you don't actually meet that rate, of course, you get dinged and ultimately you'll be fired. So those spaces, you have to kind of go inside them to see and to feel those consequences, those sort of lived realities of algorithmic systems, and to take them down from the cloud and to really see them on Earth.
Yeah, and that's especially important because then that methodology also becomes part of the argument of the book, which is that, as you were mentioning, the abstraction of AI, you argue, I think you're citing in that passage, Hart and Negri, that, abstraction is what allows extraction. And so the abstraction of AI is actually the way that AI is allowed to be an extractive industry, and therefore to write a book that doesn't go on the ground is to then perhaps participate in its further abstraction.
Precisely. And that's the thing that I think, worries me most about the AI discourse that we have in the mainstream today, which is that by abstracting away these costs, these very real costs, we are in fact supporting an extractive industry. And I really do think that AI is the growing extractive industry of the 21st century, in the same way that mining was in the 18th and 19th centuries, something that is now so central and driving so much of the economy. I mean, if you just look at who the richest people are in the world, sort of the top 10, 8 of them are coming from the AI sector. And again, if we look at how much money, for example, Jeff Bezos made just in 2020, just during this pandemic, I believe it's of the order of around $75 billion. That's just on top of what he already had. So that sense of the capital drive behind these industries, which is so profound at this point, and I think so much a reflection of and a driver of late capitalism, that you really have to sort of put it in these larger contexts. In some ways, really, this is a book of political economy, but it's also a book of grounding that discourse to try and break that sort of twin move that Hart and Negri talk about of abstraction and extraction, which is so often joined together.
I love there's a moment when you're talking about these very issues and histories around, particularly around the mining of lithium crystal, where you cite one of my favorite books, which is Gray Brecken's Imperial San Francisco. And, it really is a stunning connection, to talk about, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, Google as being the kind of contemporary banks of the 19th century, participating and creating the gold rush of the 21st century. And so I'm just, those historical connections continue to really interest me. And I'm curious how, kind of how you found your way to those earlier histories of the gold rush from lithium mining in the contemporary moment. Was that an obvious connection for you as you were, as you started on the project?
Well, first of all, absolutely joining you in fandom of Gray's work, and certainly that book, Imperial San Francisco, has been a big influence on me. But it's interesting to think about the ways in which these histories are layered on top of each other. As you're walking down the street in San Francisco, you're seeing the high rises that were built literally from extracting from the ground. I mean, Gray uses this idea of the skyscrapers being inverted minescapes. Right. The same technology that brought the workers up and down in the mines are the ones that are taking the workers up and down the skyscrapers. But certainly that those sorts of center periphery relationships between San Francisco and the landscapes around it have played out time and time again. And you can see it in the Mexico-American War. You can see it again played out in the gold fields. And now with Silicon Valley, the same thing is happening. So for me, it was that odd sense of the deeper I went into the research for this book, the more you can inhabit those multiple timelines and see the way in which those sort of very profound extractive practices of Silicon Valley, working very similar to the way that the banks did, 150 years prior, as that sort of intermediary to global planetary extraction, which is then creating enormous amounts of value for them. So again, I sort of connect that in the book through the landscapes. It's by going out to the old gold rush towns, places like Silver Lake, and going to the buildings that have been hollowed out and left from previous mining rushes. Again, and there's a moment where I sort of was walking through the hills and came across these old buildings that were the site of what was previously a really sort of thriving town in sort of 1912 to sort of 1921, short period of time, but it was all about gold and silver extraction. And people lived there, and it was this sort of vibrant place. And then they used it all up. And of course, all the cyanide leaching poisoned the landscape. And then it was unusable. Mm-hmm. And then I was looking back down at this sort of big lithium lake, just in this huge desert landscape, and thinking, that's the next thing that is going to be used up. And it will be sort of, again, this poisoned landscape with no more lithium left. So yes, those ideas of overlaying time and space it has been a sort of a big journey in creating the atlas, and San Francisco is just a repeated hub throughout the book.
And one of the things that I found surprising in that book was the history of UC Berkeley as being part of that history of extraction. And I'm wondering, in the contemporary moment, and I don't, unless I'm misremembering, this doesn't come up in the atlas. So I wanted to ask you about it, which is the role of universities in all of these issues that you're talking about, and particularly, maybe just to kind of narrow that down, all the stuff that you write about that we can talk more about the, NIST archives and ImageNet that you mentioned, this new era of extreme data harvesting. When I hear when I hear people use the term data sets, for example, mm-hmm. I'm never sure if those data sets are actually part of the same quote unquote problem, that, what is the role of the data set in the kind of in the issues that you're talking about in the book?
Oh, look, this is such a rich question. And let's take the university piece first. I mean, so many of the techniques and practices of artificial intelligence today, really started in the university sector, but also in defense, really sort of funded by the Department of Defense to create the capacities for certain priorities that were essentially military priorities around, object detection, automated vehicles, detecting people from their faces and being able to ascribe that to an identity. These were essentially sort of military priorities that were then pushed into and funded into the university sectors. And there you start to see these kinds of parallel worlds of the commercial visions of artificial intelligence and the military sort of visions of artificial intelligence. One of the things that I did for this book was access the Snowden archives, thanks to Laura Poitras, the journalist and filmmaker. For me, it was like sort of going into this extraordinary kind of different universe of AI. It really is sort of the parallel AI development. And to see how those priorities began to merge, particularly in the early 2000s, as we see the shift towards machine learning. Now, universities, are incredibly important here because that's where we train people to build technical systems. But there's a problem, which is that traditionally, computer science and engineering have been seen as disciplines that don't really engage with human subjects. They don't go through ethical review. They don't do training in what are the sort of larger sociological implications of these systems. It simply hasn't been the way those disciplines have been formed and understood. But now, things that were previously very much in theory and sort of built in labs are touching the lives of billions of people every day. And we haven't caught up. So I think in many ways, universities are sort of working with these older siloed approaches of seeing the computer sciences as a sort of mathematical discipline that's at arm's length from human bodies, when the reverse is actually the case. The other problem I want to touch on here too is that, of course, as industry becomes, incredibly powerful, it has been hiring so many people out of the university sector. So, we have fewer and fewer people who are there to engage in the pedagogy of actually teaching the next generation of people working on these systems and thinking about their implications. So that's another problem there as well. When it comes to data sets, though, Josh, that's a whole hour-long conversation in itself, because there's so much to say there. If there's an original sin, I think, of the field, it's this moment when the idea of just harvesting the entire internet, taking people's photos, taking their texts, taking their responses to each other, and seeing it as an infrastructure, an aggregate infrastructure that had no sort of specific histories or stories or intimacies or vulnerabilities contained within it, to strip it of all that and say, this is just raw material, very much scare quotes around that, to drive large-scale systems of prediction and optimization. Yeah. That has brought us to this point where I think we should be asking much harder questions of those data sets, not only because of their origins, but because of the way in which they bring smuggling in a worldview that is so rarely questioned and is producing some very serious harms.
Yeah, and perhaps are participating in what you call the end of consent, where there are data sets that represent full lives, that represent biographies, that represent identities that are taken in most cases against the will or even without the person knowing it. So I wanted to maybe focus on that for a second, because I thought your discussion in the book around ImageNet and the end of consent was particularly frightening. I think I'm not someone who is knee deep in AI research and AI writing. So I kind of suspected that, and I had a very, mild notion of it. But the depth that you show us of the extent of which data harvesting without consent is not an anomaly, but is widespread, is perhaps part of the air that we're all now breathing, is quite terrifying. And I'm wondering, back on the history front, is there a moment for you where the end of consent began? Like, was there a kind of turning point?
Oh, lovely. The histories that I think are really interesting are sort of the moments of the sort of epistemological shift, the shift in how data was seen and understood as sort of knowledge making. And I'm thinking here of the work of a scholar called Cha-Cheng Li, who really dug into the moment at the IBM Continuous Speech Recognition Lab. This was sort of in the 60s and 70s, where there was this mode. Actually, interesting, Robert Mercer, who is, of course, the billionaire that many of you would know for, having actually been funding Breitbart and Trump, for example. This was back when he was a machine learning researcher. And there was this moment where he shifted from trying to create systems that could understand language, that would try to sort of think about human language and its rules and its sort of modes and what it meant, what the meaning was, and to think about it purely as statistical data as aggregates, where it was less important what the meaning was, but how many times a word would be used in relation to another word. So to do that shift, to make that shift to a statistical analysis rather than a sort of more linguistic one, you just need huge amounts of data. And so what they did is that they started sort of trying to collect it from wherever they could, using technical manuals, although that was found to be sort of very far from normal speech, so it didn't work very well. They used sort of legal briefs, including sort of cases where sort of, IBM itself had been the subject of litigation. They used newspapers. So again, it was this beginning to crawl and grab for every type of data that was available. And then you sort of take that moment and you fast forward it to 10 years ago when ImageNet is being created. And the objective of the research team was explicitly to map the entire world of objects. So when you have these sort of huge ambitions to capture and contain the entire world, it is driven by this extractive impulse to get as much data as possible at any cost, really. And in that sense, we've seen the downsides of that, because all of those collections of data come with histories.
Yeah.
They can't be separated from them, and some of those histories contain very problematic structural forms of inequality, racism, sexism, classism, and that then creates the systems that we use in the future. So that's probably one of the moments, but there are many. And they're continuing to happen because, of course, the biggest training sets are owned by companies like, Facebook, Google, Amazon, and we can't see those, unlike the training sets that you can see in universities.
Yeah. So this book, Kate, obviously joins a kind of robust and growing literature over the past even 3 years, 4 years around the kind of social implications of AI, particularly as you were just mentioning around questions of bias and discrimination around race and gender. And there's a moment in the book where you make this point, and I was just wondering if you could maybe expand on it a little bit for the audience, which is you write that machine learning systems do not just build on already existing kind of histories of bias and of racial and gender inequality, but actually and actively constructs them. So I think we're perhaps very familiar with them replicating discrimination, but could you talk more about how they are actively constructing?
Well, you're right that there is a moment in the field, and I want to particularly point to work by scholars like Ruha Benjamin, Sophia Noble, Ma Hicks, Alondra Nelson, who are really sort of doing the work of looking at sort of large-scale technical systems and these sort of deep histories around sort of race, gender, sexuality, and how those kinds of perspectives get built into these tools. I'm also really interested in how, once they're built into these tools, they create these feedback loops that actually construct forms of gender identity and understandings of ourselves. And this is something also that Ian Hacking, who's someone who has written very powerfully on the histories of probability and statistics, calls a sort of a feedback loop, that once you've created classifications for people begin to mold themselves to those classifications, to be recognized by those systems, to receive opportunities, but also to change the way they understand themselves. And there are so many instances of this that technical systems will set at a sort of very high level how people are to be understood. Take, for example, Facebook used to have binary gender, and then after lots of complaints and pushback, moved to 56 categories for gender, which, sounds like an improvement, but is also a pretty, if you think about it, an arbitrary number, it could be a lot bigger than that. And you could also just have an open text field. Why are we having to have drop-down menus to define who we are? But certainly the way that these systems and ways of knowing get built into things like insurance, get built into hiring. So forms of identity become molded into how you will be seen and understood, and then the life path that you will actually be able to take. So part of that is external and about opportunity, but part of it is internal, about how we understand and recognize and mold ourselves to be recognized by technical systems.
Mm-hmm. So kind of to continue on that point, one of the really interesting and compelling moments for me in the book, you've already mentioned, which is when you're in the West Texas desert, traveling to the Bezos space colony launch field. And it of course strikes me that that's also a geography that connects to a point you make elsewhere in the book, That's a geography that's, I don't know exactly where that site is, but I'm guessing it's roughly an hour and a half, maybe 2 hour drive to the Texas-Mexico border. And, as you point out, that border has become completely datafied. My colleague at USC, Juan de Lara, talks about it as a smart, kind of the implications of the smart border. And you talk about Palantir and using, kind of feeding data to ICE, Falcon, Vigilant. I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about those just kind of incredible risks where that kind of data harvesting that you were already talking about are being fed into these systems of deportation and detention and kind of illegalization north and south of the U.S.-Mexico border.
And this is where I think your work is so important in thinking about those sorts of border sites and how they become operationalized by particular types of state and technocratic logics. The shift to, and the irony of the smart border too here, when these tools are in fact just so profoundly dumb in terms of the way that they work, and I think so predatory in the way that they harvest data from so many sources, and then are used to sort of trap and control populations, particularly immigrant populations, but across the board. Companies like Palantir are really there and servicing groups like the LAPD, also ICE. Like across the board, this is becoming the tools of military and policing that are being drawn from data sites and from locations that people would in many ways think of as quite benign. So for me, that's sort of that shift towards these types of threat scoring of individuals and the sort of predatory capture of data and people by using these systems. Borders are the locations where you can really see this at its most brutal and most extreme, but it's happening throughout the US in particular and globally, but the US is certainly one of the sort of leading countries that is using these tools on its population. So one of the really sort of horrifying things for me as a researcher was looking at the ways in which these systems, which were primarily designed for intelligence agencies that are extra legal by design, have now sort of filtered down to the municipal level, that are literally being used by local police departments that are connecting to people's Amazon Ring cameras that they have on the front of their houses. And these sort of sites of data ingestion are then being fed into the engines of deportation. And those stories need to be told far more often, that as we subscribe to new forms of tracking and monitoring our own homes and our own bodies, that we could actually be providing more data to precisely those incredibly unjust systems.
Is that combination of kind of everyday actions that are seen as benign becoming the foundation for acts of violence, surveillance, discrimination, detention? Is that unique to the AI industries, do you think?
Not at all. I think in so many ways, this is a very common shift in how consumer systems work. We're slowly sort of sleepwalking into significant social and political change without having those stakes laid out for us. I think in many ways because they are intentionally hidden and they overlap in sort of multiple types of systems. For me, one of the real sort of watershed moments in my work was doing this project called The Anatomy of AI with Vladan Jola, where we just tried to take a single AI consumer system. It was the Amazon Echo. You might know these systems. They look like little, banal cylinders that you might, sit in your living room or if in your bedroom if you're not afraid of listening devices. And, you just interact with it to sort of do searches and say, oh, Alexa, what's the weather today? And we tried to map that from the very moment of where the minerals are extracted, where do they come from, who mines them, how much are they paid, through the smelting processes, through the logistics and shipping, all through the data pipelines, what happens to your voice when it's collected and how is it analyzed, and through to the end of life of those devices, which is sadly less than generally around sort of 4 years. They get discarded into e-waste tips in places like Ghana and Pakistan. that process for me was one of really opening my own eyes and to see how many of these choices that we make are actually feeding these much bigger systems of extraction. And it was in doing that, sort of just doing that big sort of exploded map of a single device, that was a moment where I realized I wanted to see that at a bigger scale, to see it across the entire AI industry. And so that was really the genesis of the Atlas of AI.
Right. So you go from a kind of anatomy model to the Atlas model. And, you know, early in the book, when you're talking about your decision to use the Atlas as a frame, you know, you mentioned, you know, another thing that is a kind of favorite of my own thinking, which is the medieval, you know, mappa mundi. And, you know, one of the things that I love about those medieval maps, of course, famously, is that when the cartographers, is that, you know, these maps were actually documents of what people did not know. You know, they were documents of fiction. And when the map makers would find an area that they didn't think they could map, they would just write, "Here be dragons." And they would draw these dragons. So I wanted to ask you, like, for you and your Atlas, like, were there dragons for you? Were there these kind of unknown spots that for you still are these areas that are exciting you for, you know, a further cartography of what AI is?
Absolutely, and yes, and even just to begin back with the Mappa Mundi, to think about the ways in which it was mapping the unknown, but also the deep hopes and beliefs of the cartographers. And sometimes they were religious beliefs, sometimes they were geopolitical hopes and beliefs around sort of dominating space and capturing terrain. And so, you know, there's this fantastic line by a thinker who's really influenced me by the name of Ursula Franklin, who was a physicist and technology critic. And she talks about the ways in which maps bridge between the known and the unknown and sort of become these objects of collective insight. Mm-hmm. And that's why Atlas, you know, the Atlas metaphor is really important to me, because it's a way of clearly looking at different scales. You know, an atlas can allow you to look at the entire planet or to zoom into a city or a mountain range, but also to refer to collective insight, because there are so many people working in domains that I think will shed light on those darker corners, on discovering where the dragons are, because this is going to be a big collective effort, not just in terms of researching and understanding the implications of these systems, but I think how we connect the justice movements that we will need to respond to them. How do we connect calls for climate justice, for labor rights, for data protection? How do we bring those together? And certainly those moves are underway. But I think that's how we are going to not just discover, but also contend with those dragons that really do lurk in so many corners of the supply chains of artificial intelligence.
Absolutely. So here's my last question for you, which goes to this very point you just made. You know, as we've been talking about, this book is, you know, is a critique at every turn. And so I do want to ask you, and I know you've thought about this, if you were to write the next volume of this, which is the kind of, you know, maybe action steps or, you know, action manifesto for living and resisting AI. You know, other scholars, as I know you know, have called for the creation of, you know, an FDA for algorithms. Have talked about, you know, the kind of question of AI oversight as the next great civil rights movement. You know, is there anything that can be done beyond more ethics panels, more accountability, or is really this another question of abolition? Is this a system that needs to be completely torn down?
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is the most pressing question, and I would strongly agree with you that this does present as the civil rights fight for, you know, the next decade and beyond. But really, when it comes to these sort of poles between abolition and reform, we have faced this time and time again. And again, I always turn to history here. And what we learn from those histories is that there is a gigantic mistake that is made when we assume a type of technological inevitability. when we assume that because something is made and it is possible, that it must be used and it must be deployed. That impulse is something that I think we must resist. And certainly one of the things in the book that I write about is this idea of the politics of refusal. Where does that work? How can that actually create spaces where these systems aren't deployed? How do we ask harder questions about why we should accept this as a sort of a turnkey technology that somehow would be seen as just as useful, in teaching a child as it would be in, scanning the sky? These are very different tasks. Why do we assume that this technology is not going to create these very real downsides that we've already seen? So in terms of how we navigate those two shifts, I think for me, it's really about looking to those broader communities. It is actually looking at the communities who are doing that work, communities of researchers, of activists, of artists, and doing that collectively. I think the work of making those decisions and sort of writing those stories is going to be a practice that we engage in together.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Kate. We have some great questions that if you're okay with, we'll spend a little bit more time here. And actually, I wanted to start with one that is very topical and actually comes from a USC colleague of ours now, from Andy Lakoff, whose question is, you mentioned some of the boosterism about the role of AI in biomedicine. I'm wondering about its role, not only in the US, but also in other countries in response to the coronavirus pandemic. I'm thinking, for instance, of tools for tracking the movement of individuals and populations in relation to testing and tracking those who may have been exposed to the virus. To what extent has the pandemic offered an opportunity for the expansion and intensification of some of the dangerous applications of AI that you discuss?
Spot on, Andy. You're exactly right. In fact, it is one of the things that has concerned me the most, over the last year, is seeing the way in which these systems have been pushed ever deeper into some of the most sensitive social institutions we have, like criminal justice, like sort of, state monitoring and large-scale population surveillance and education. At every juncture, you've seen companies use this as an excuse. It's funny, Alondra Nelson and I recently gave a talk thinking about the pandemic as pretext. It sort of acts as this pretext for rolling out technologies that, in many cases, simply, first of all, don't do what they say they will do. And even if they did, you wouldn't want them to be doing that. Sort of the way I think about it is that these tools are sort of dangerous when they fail and harmful when they work. And we've been seeing that shift. The other thing I want to say, Andy, too, about this question, and it troubles me, it's not a straightforward answer, is that, under a pandemic, how do we think about intelligent public policy making at a national level? I mean, we've seen, as an A/B test that's been running, live for the last year of our lives, we've seen how bad public policy can get in the US, just how shocking and how many lives were lost. And then I've been sort of spending time in Australia and seeing sort of the differences there and relationships between checking into venues and how do we feel about those sort of surveillance practices. So I think we have to be pretty nuanced about the technologies that have helped and where they don't. And that requires this much more granular analysis that I think has been missing in much of the AI discourse.
So there's a few questions that kind of all hover around the same question that I'll pose to you, which is about what mechanisms do you think we have at our disposal to limit the deployment of harmful AI tools?
We have many mechanisms. I mean, some of those mechanisms are the traditional ones. We have protest. I mean, we've seen the extraordinary power of protest, both, public protest in the streets, but also sort of protest sort of within institutions that are deploying these technologies. We've seen protests within universities. We've seen them sort of within government bodies. Those moments are actually really important, those sort of flashpoints of pushback. One of the questions that's sort of interesting and something that I've been exploring with Mike Annenberg, who's also at USC, and Michael Medeo, who's at MSR, is sort of thinking about the questions of scale there too. How do you scale refusal of a technical system? I mean, we can say that, Oakland, for example, is, banning facial recognition, and Somerville, but, what does that mean for the towns around them? What does it mean for the communities that don't have those strong and powerful activist networks who are pushing back? How do we match the scale of essentially planetary compute with communities saying, these are not things that we want to work here. That process, that shift between scales, I think is one of the hard questions to ask about how pushback is going to work. But certainly it's something that I think it's a muscle that we need to exercise more. I think we've become very kind of lax in accepting innovation as always a good thing, rather than really testing the presumptions and looking at those longer term impacts.
Yeah, I mean, we can all make these individual decisions, right? So on the one hand, you can choose not to buy an Echo or Alexa or whatever. And that, I don't own one. And that feels to me like, okay, I've drawn some line in the sand, for myself as a consumer. And yet there is a kind of hypocrisy in that, that I have to call myself on, is then I'll just go and use Amazon online and, participate in all kinds of other systems of surveillance and predation and inequality. So, a couple of the questions that kind of pose this about, if we're all complicit in this, even without, especially without knowing it every day, just with everyday computing behavior and consumption behavior, and certainly with the pandemic, with the fully kind of onlineification of all consumption, right? That, again, people want to know, Kate Crawford, what can we do? What can we do on an individual level?
Well, Josh Kuhn, let me tell you, this is something that, that I struggle with personally as much as I think all of us do. And it was interesting to see sort of pre-pandemic, how I'd really kind of stopped ordering a lot of things from Amazon. And then when that moment hit, it almost felt as if everybody had this moment of like, oh, these systems are actually the things that are going to save us. And it was almost this excuse to kind of go back to the easy kind of one-click lifestyle. But I really think there's a trap here too in assuming that this is a consumer choice problem. This is not a consumer choice problem. This is a structural and political issue, and it really needs to be addressed as such. We are talking about, a handful of companies that have an enormous amount of power in deciding not only our lives and how systems work, but also what will happen at a planetary level, over the next decades. And that's something that really needs to be thought about in a sort of regulatory sense at a government level, rather than trying to say, I'm participating in, forms of techno-capitalism. It's like, yes, it's almost impossible not to. Yeah. So I really want to sort of give people that moment of saying, use that energy not to try and say, am I being an ethical consumer of technology, but to say, how can I use my vote, my protest, and my way of responding that will actually produce structural change? How is that kind of activism collectively more possible, rather than trying to sort of buy right?
So maybe last question, Dustin Rush, who's asking, are there any guiding principles being developed around responsible AI? Not standards of regulation, but just ethical principles to open up the conversation.
Oh boy, yes. I would say, I think that the last count that I saw, there's something like 259 ethical codes that have been released, not just at sort of national levels, but by companies, by NGOs, by organizations, that have been widely sort of discussed and reported on. They are everywhere. This is certainly, I think, in some ways, necessary but not sufficient, shall we say. It's great that people are thinking about certainly the ethics of technical design and how we build systems. But how do you hold people to account? How do you make the shift from someone having a very shiny sort of list of ethical principles and the impacts of their technology in the world? And what we've seen over the last few years, when companies have attempted this, so say, for example, when Google released their ethical principles and created an ethical board, it folded within months. It was one of those moments of seeing that all of the pressures on a company to really be held to account. And those connections haven't been made yet, which is why I think we rest far too much hope in the idea that sort of ethical guidelines will save the day here. I think we need far bigger tools for making those changes.
Kate, I just want to thank you for this wonderful conversation, and thank everybody for joining us, and to really celebrate you on the publication of this book. I hope everybody gets the chance to check it out. I do think we need a toast.
Oh yeah, let's do it.
So we can't see all of you who are watching this, but if people want to, if this is your excuse to go grab a glass of something, whatever it is, go for it. I've heard that the best way to recover from the second shot of the vaccine is whiskey. So that's what I'm going to toast you with.
That is always a good choice, I think, Josh. Whiskey often saves the day. I'm going to be a traditionalist because this is actually the official day of US publication. So I'm going to do a bit of a champagne pop. There we go. Excellent. I hope Zoom captioned that.
Well done.
Here we go.
You didn't have the fear on your face that I have when I open a champagne bottle.
I had that moment of like, it's just going to fly into the screen. It'll be like one of those kind of fantastic gifts that I can use forever. Can I just say thank you to you, Josh? This was such a really engaging conversation. And I really love the way that you've engaged at the deepest levels of the book and what it's trying to do. So I really appreciate you taking that time at a time when time is short. So it means a lot.
But it's a wonderful book. So cheers and congrats.
Cheers.
Welcome to Annenberg.
Cheers, Josh. Thank you. Cheers, everybody.